Good evening. Welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. I'm Karen Taylor. I'm Program Director for the General Society. I'd like to give a very warm welcome to all of you. Tonight's lecture is part of the Labour, Literature and Landmark Lecture series, and in fact is our final literature lecture for the spring season. The Labour, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a very brief introduction. The Society of Mechanics and General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen was founded in 1785, 232 years ago. Today, the organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, of course, the General Society Library, of which you're in this evening. And by the way, for anyone interested, you will find library membership information on the front table. Our upstairs Lock Museum, which I do invite you to browse after the event this evening. And finally, our nearly €200 lecture series, of which tonight's lecture is part of. You will also find an informational postcard on your seat that provides some background information on the Society. For this program, we're delighted to have an opportunity to partnership with the Historic District Council. And I would like to welcome all their members here this evening. The program was suggested to us by the HDC's Executive Director, Simeon. And to introduce the event this evening, I'm now very pleased to introduce Simeon to you. Thank you.
Go this way. Good evening, everyone. I'm Simeon Bankoff, Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. It's a pleasure to be here in such a wonderful, wonderful historic setting. HDC is always thrilled to have an opportunity to partner with the General Society of Tradesmen and Mechanics, and we hope to do so again in the future, both because we share many of the same goals and you've got a fantastic space. It's been a pleasure, and my thanks to Karen and the whole team at the General Society for making this such a breeze to go through. I just made a phone call and then made another phone call, and there were 3 emails, and here we all are. So it's for those of you who do not know, the Historic Districts Council is the citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. We deal with 500 neighborhood-based community groups in all 5 boroughs, trying to preserve and enhance and protect the physical character of their neighborhoods, their buildings, their streetscapes. We do this through 3 basic program areas: advocacy, community outreach, and educational programming, of which this panel is one of them. It's a pleasure, it's a real pleasure to be able to have John Gill with us this evening. I first met John over the telephone when he was an intrepid reporter and I was an intrepid source, talking about things such as the endangered sculpture garden behind the Brooklyn Museum, as well as the many historic buildings that John has written about. It's funny, there are many connections between John and myself. We both went to Sarah Lawrence College. He has a brother-in-law named Simeon, which is the only other Simeon I've ever met in person. It's a little disturbing. In fact, I know his mother reasonably well, Jill Gill, who is an artist of New York City and a great friend of HDC. So it's a real pleasure to be able to have this evening with John. I heartily recommend the book, which I've been devouring on the subway, which is taking longer and longer, so it'll probably be done by probably tomorrow morning at this point. So. One last thing, we do have, although this is the end of the fiscal year for the city, so therefore we're packing lots and lots and lots of tours in the last couple of days. We do have a special, very, very peculiar but special, slightly expensive, I should warn you, opportunity to go into the Woolworth Building on June June 20th, thank you. It's going to be cocktails in the newly designed residences of the Woolworth Building. I will warn you, it's $200, but this is probably the only time many of us will ever have a chance to go into these new residences on the 39th floor that are retailing for $10 million and kind of experience the Terra Cotta really up front and in your face. So there's a little thing about that on the table, and you could call us at the office, 212-614-9107, or check out our website, which this is not listed on, but you can find our phone number there. Our website's hdc.org. Now, John, please.
Let's see if we can. Hi, folks. Thanks so very much for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. I love this organization, and Simeon does fantastic work as well in the HDC. This evening, I thought what I had in mind was going to be kind of an oddball blend of fact and fiction, which is very much what my novel, The Gargoyle Hunters, is. I thought it would be fun. I did an awful lot of research for this book, and I thought it would be interesting and fun to trace my creative process. Basically, I'm going to tell you about all the research that I did for one particular chapter, and then I'm going to read you an excerpt of one of these chapters so you can see how the research I did basically became sort of the factual joists that supported my imagination. You can find out what my imagination did with all of the history I unearthed. The book, The Gargoyle Hunters, I assume many of you have not read it yet. It's about many things. It's set in 1974, 1975 New York City. It's about fragmentation. It's about a fragmenting family in the fragmenting city of 1970s New York, which is the city of my childhood. The protagonist is Griffin Watts. He's 13 years old in 1974, and I think of Griffin as a precocious innocent. He is caught between warring parents in the aftermath of a difficult divorce, and what he chiefly wants is to forge some kind of relationship with his estranged father. And so Griffin allows himself to be recruited into his father's illicit and very dangerous architectural salvage business. And Griffin is very small, he's very nimble, and this means that his father rather exploits him and sends him climbing around the tops of iconic New York City skyscrapers and on the tops of unsung tenements to literally remove with power saws or crowbars, whatever comes to hand, the really expressive, exuberantly expressive 19th century terracotta castings and stone carvings that routinely adorn buildings put up in that period in the late 19th century, early 20th century in New York City. It's really sort of, I think, of the glory days of New York City architecture. I had two main objectives with the book. I wanted to tell two stories at the same time. I wanted to tell a small, intimate story of fathers and sons, and I also wanted to tell a big story about the near death of New York City in 1974, 1975. The book takes place in basically the 18 months leading up to the famous daily news headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead," when we nearly defaulted on our debt here in New York. So once I realized that these two stories could be told in the same book in an organic way, the world of architectural salvage in 1970s New York, which I did a lot of research on, it became both a metaphor for the disintegration of the family in this book, but also I'm a reporter by trade, and it became a very real, concrete, nuts and bolts backdrop in which the story of the father and son could play out. So the 1970s New York City, I'm sure many of this is a great audience to be in front of because I'm sure many of you remember it, was a pretty vividly crumbling place where pretty much anything that was not nailed down was stolen. There was, in fact, a major New York City 19th century architect was literally stolen off of his plinth in Central Park and melted down probably for belt buckles or something. I think that at that time, everything was crumbling. There was one building in particular, one iconic New York City skyscraper that was disintegrating before our eyes in that period, and that was the Woolworth Building. The Woolworth Building, as you can see, all of you know it probably very well. It's flamboyantly Gothic, gorgeous building put up in 1913. At the time, it was the tallest building in the world, and it's a very grand building, and this image here, however, is a pretty intimate view. This is actually the view from my sister's loft in Tribeca on Duane Street, looking sort of southeast. And I fell in love with the building, and it exercised a great hold on my imagination starting in the 1990s, early 1990s, when I was in graduate school. I worked in my sister's antique frame restoration studio, which was in this building on Duane Street, and I would gild historic frames and regild them. And every day I would sort of take some time to commune with this building. And the Woolworth Building this painting is by my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, Simeon Lagodich. It's the other Simeon that he referenced before. The building, to me, there was always something sort of majestic and otherworldly about it. It became kind of a living character to me. And over the months and years, it actually changes its moods. It has such a complexly textured facade that it changes its moods in different lights and seasons and weather. And so it sort of, for me, it became almost sort of my version of Monet's haystacks, the way it would change. The building is really a dynamic one. And so when I decided to write this book, The Gargoyle Hunters, I was dead set on the idea that I was going to set a pivotal scene on the richly ornamented crown of the Woolworth Building. I didn't know anything about the richly ornamented crown of the Woolworth Building at that time, but I came to. And so this here is a plate this is largely what the frontispiece of the Gargoyle Hunters looks like. I gave this image to the designer because I wanted them to use it for the frontispiece. I think it's very beautiful, but it's not meant to be beautiful. It's meant to be useful. It's a technical manual from 1914 called Architectural Terra Cotta Standard Construction, and it's really just to tell contractors how to install gargoyles into the sides of the buildings. This guy up here, does that work? Yeah. This guy here, who's sort of lunging off the building in a dynamic way, is similar to the gargoyle in the section I'm going to read to you. And what you can see there is that he's actually held onto the building with a bronze rod. There's a nut and bolt in his mouth. There's a bronze rod meant not to corrode in the weather that goes through his body and ties into the steel behind the terracotta. And this was very much the kind of gargoyle I imagined that my characters, the father and son, would steal from the top of the Woolworth Building. To research, so the Woolworth Building, of course, is a real building. I was quite comfortable making things up. I have a vivid imagination, and if I had made up the building, I might have made up the details. But it's a real building, and I wanted my scene at the top of the Woolworth Building to be so authoritative or authentic that even somebody who knew the building like the back of their hand would say, yeah, that could actually happen. And so I found there was a massive restoration, 6-year restoration that took place on the Woolworth Building in the 1970s, starting in 1975. And I found a guy, a preservation architect, who was on and off of the scaffolds outside of the Woolworth Building in the 1970s. And his name is Tim Allenbrook. He's a preservation architect. And he helped me out a lot. I did extensive research, extensive interviews with him. But my sort of fantasy in the first few interviews was maybe he would have one photograph, maybe 2 photographs of the top of the Woolworth Building that I could maybe use to anchor my flights of fancy in fact. So I sort of hesitantly said to him, because I thought it was a long shot, Tim, do you have any snapshots? Any of your buddies take a snapshot of you at the top of the building? Top of the Woolworth Building in the 70s. He said, John, as a matter of fact, I have an entire PowerPoint presentation of just how we did the Woolworth restoration in the 1970s. It's full of archival photos, and I would be really happy to share that with you. So many of the photos, not all of them by any stretch, but many of the photos in this presentation are actually Tim's photos from the restoration survey in the 70s. And then Tim did another amazing thing, which he sort of fact-checked my imagination. I would go off and work and come up with a scenario about how these characters could climb around the top of the Woolworth Building and remove, they don't say remove or steal, they say liberate. They would liberate a gargoyle from the top of the building. The characters in this book, particularly the father, operate in, there were really people who did this, not on the Woolworth Building, but there really were gargoyle hunters who stole/rescued architectural sculptures in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of buildings that were being destroyed during urban renewal. The characters in my book, the father in particular, operates, however, in a kind of moral gray area where he's something of a preservation zealot. In some ways, he's preserving the city's past, and in other ways, he's really just a common thief. And I think different readers will bring different attitudes to that point. So I think to give you the background for the scene I'm going to read to you, it's the best thing to do is start at the beginning. This is the Woolworth Building, obviously. This is around 1913, the birth of the Woolworth Building. And when that building, the building was opened with dazzling showmanship in 1913. In those days, you know, nowadays when a giant building goes up, 432 Park Avenue or one of these monstrosities that's going to go up on and around 57th Street, we all bitch and moan, oh, it's too tall, everything's too big now. But when the Woolworth Building was built in 1913, people were pretty excited about it. It was seen as a triumph of engineering, of commerce, probably of American might. It was conceived of as a great moment. And so people actually thronged City Hall Park. And that's the old General Post Office at the south end of City Hall Park, long gone. But people would, people thronged the park there, City Hall Park, and Lower Broadway. And at nighttime, in one evening, I say it was opened with dazzling showmanship because President Woodrow Wilson, sitting in the White House, pressed a button at nighttime and illuminated the Woolworth Building at one time with 80,000 light bulbs. So it was a big spectacle. Everybody loved it. It was on the front pages of the newspapers and so forth. But the building, of course, so it was 60 stories. It was this flamboyant Gothic Terra Cotta building, and it was the tallest in the world. But it's not famous. It wasn't famous and isn't famous just for its height. It was also for its rather remarkable terracotta facade. It's done in the sort of flamboyant Gothic style, and the whole building is really richly festooned with all kinds of Gothic gables and crockets and gargoyles. This guy up here, so this here is a crocket, and this is a Tourelle. We're going to talk about this quite a bit more in a minute, but this is about the 55th story. The scene I'm going to read to you actually takes place exactly on this level, right here on the top of this Tourelle like this one. The Terra Cotta has this ability. Terra Cotta is a fired clay that's cast usually from plaster molds. Terra Cotta literally means burnt earth in Italian. And I think the architect Cass Gilbert, who designed the Woolworth Building, said that he chose it. It has an ability to be cast in a very light, sort of almost lacy way that gave a lightness to this very large building. And Cass Gilbert was so fastidious with the terracotta that he said he chose the terracotta for the facade of the Woolworth Building because he wanted to clothe it with beauty. He wanted to give the great city the great building it deserved, which I think he did. He was very successful at that. But he was very fastidious. He made sure that all of the draftsmen who were drawing all this intricate terracotta, I mean, every inch of this building was drawn before it was molded and then cast. He had the draftsmen all work in the office next to his, so that he could keep an eye on them. And he insisted that the original clay models from which the terracotta was ultimately cast were sculpted by an Italian sculptor named Alessio Ricci. And Ricci had studied sculpture in Florence. He immigrated to the States in the 1890s, and then he really sort of incised his imagination into our skyline here in New York. I mean, we owe him a lot. And in one thing, just briefly, terracotta is the way it would work. There's different casting methods, but basically Ricci would cast. He would model out of clay every one of these ornaments a full size, and then after the clay dried, it would be cast. Plaster molds would be made rather from the clay, and then the terracotta is cast from those molds and delivered to the work site here. The terracotta on this building is beautiful, but it was a massive headache. The terracotta has been from day one on the Woolworth Building as much a curse as a blessing for the successive owners of the Woolworth Building. It is beautiful, yes, but it actually began to fail almost the moment they put it on the building. And in fact, there is a letter in 1913, within 6 months after the building went up, there's a letter from Frank Woolworth, the founder and chairman of the Woolworth Company, to Cass Gilbert, the architect, saying, the terracotta is cracking already. What the hell's going on here? Can you fix this? And it only got worse. And in fact, the focus of the section I'm going to read to you is these objects, these architectural elements on the corners. These are called Tourelles. these four, I think of these Tourelles, they're little, means little tower, right? These are the little towers, the Tourelles are at the, I think of, on the four corners of the Woolworth's roof there, and I think of them as the jewels of the Woolworth's crown. One way to think of their shape, as I read this to you, is they're sort of like, they're 5 or 6 stories tall. They're like giant white asparaguses, right? They've got a vertical shaft and they're pointy at the top. And so what's a Tourelle? The kid in the book, Griffin, who's 13, he wonders what a Tourelle is. He sort of thinks it might be part of the name of a 1950s singing group. You know, ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce to you Frank Woolworth and the Terrells. But in fact, they are these little towers at the corner of the building. And there's an interesting fact. These Tourelles are one of the most intricate parts of the building. They are adorned with terra cotta in a rising rhythm of textures and colors. 3 of the Tourelles up here are solid. They're closed at the top, the conical part, the conical top. One thing that very few people know is that one of them, on the northeastern corner, so this is the uptown side overlooking Broadway, overlooking City Hall Park, and the Brooklyn Bridge, and over to the municipal building, that Tourelle is open at the top. You can't see it in this image, I don't think, but I'll show you some later that you can. And there's a very specific reason. The 3 that are closed because they're purely ornamental. They're just for pretty. The one on the northeastern corner, however, was functional. It was open at the top because it happened to be the top of a chimney, the tallest chimney in the world. There was a coal furnace in the bottom, in the basement, and it was, so the top of the Tourelle is the top of a 700-foot chimney. And every day in the winter, that chimney would belch forth 1,500 pounds of coal soot every day on the top of the stunning new world-class terracotta crown. So what happened? It just totally ate away the top of the building. We always think of the top of the Woolworth Building as this green oxidized copper crown, copper roof, but in fact it actually was gilded in the early days. So the soot ate away the top of the building. It smothered the top of the building in soot and in blackness, and by the end in filth. By the end of the 20s, by 1928 or 1929, the top of the Woolworth Building was actually almost pitch black. And so what did they do? They cleaned it. They hired these crazy guys with no supporting harnesses, protective harnesses whatsoever, to climb around the top of the damn thing and scrub it. And these are the gargoyles here that we're going to concern ourselves with later. But this is crazy. And in fact, I'll show you something else. So this happens in the late 20s. In 1931, when they finished, the Woolworth company, I guess, felt it was time to do a little bit of a publicity stunt. So what I have here next to play for you is actually a newsreel from 1931 about the cleaning of the top of the Woolworth Building. Calls for men who are top of their profession, ho ho. They also mug a lot. They're hamming it up. They lean out. Okay, whatever you do, don't tell OSHA about this. Can you imagine? That's a bosun's chair, but it's basically like a backyard swing that this guy's swinging around on. Not that I know of. He's definitely not a Mohawk Indian. All right, this is what would have happened to these guys if they'd fallen off the building. So that was 1931. Now we're going to jump to the 1970s. In the intervening decades, the building just deteriorated further and further, the terracotta facade. Lots of terrible things happened. As you can see, it's almost pitch black. That over here in the background, this is actually the on-ramp to the Brooklyn Bridge. And up here, so a lot of terrible things happened to the facade, but essentially what happened was that the moisture got into the cracks in between the terracotta pieces. As you know, water freezes, it gets larger, and it expanded and pushed the terracotta out. Then, in addition, the steel behind the terracotta, the moisture got in there, it corroded the steel. When steel rusts, when it corrodes, it expands to 7 times its size. So this created enormous stress, enormous pressure on the facade of the building. And the pieces so some of these pieces of terracotta really wanted to fly right off the building. It's as if, you know, you were going to grab your shirt and yank it, and the buttons want to pop off. That's what was going on with the terracotta there. So they did actually climb around the building, and you know, with buckets of tar basically, and make these patches all over the place. And they also had some rather idiosyncratic protection methods to keep the terracotta pieces from falling off the building. This one's my favorite. This is a gargoyle wearing a copper leash. They've run a leash around his head and neck and run it up to this bolt here in the side of the building, literally in case he falls off the building. This is supposed to keep him from falling down and clobbering some poor passerby hurrying over to City Hall or the buildings department on Chambers Street. But needless to say, clearly at this point, by the 70s, the building was in massive need of restoration, and at this point, you know, the facade was actually in danger of being lost. They were almost at the point, they had deferred the maintenance for so long that they might have needed to strip the whole building. But eventually the Woolworth company did kick in. They ended up spending $20 million, it was a lot of money in the mid-70s, to the building itself. The Woolworth Building in 1913 only cost around $20 million to build. It was built, it was actually paid for by Frank Woolworth in cash. So I like to think he's the king of the 5 and dime. I like to think of these giant piles of nickels and dimes and $20 million worth that he paid for the building. But in the 70s, they spent another $20 million to restore it. It was a six-year restoration project, and they really did save the building. There's some things wrong with what happened, but they saved the building. Essentially, they replaced 26,000. They did a full survey of every piece of terracotta on the building, and they discovered that 26,000 of them were so shot that they couldn't be repaired. So they replaced them with precast concrete. But what they really had trouble with were these Tourelles that I was describing to you. So here's a Tourelle. We're looking down from, I don't know, 57th, 58th story, and you can see by the 70s, it's completely pitch black. And here are the gargoyles again I was talking about. The building here is, I mean, the Tourelle is wrapped in this black netting because they're really, it's no mystery, they're really worried that these pieces are going to fall down and crush somebody walking by on Broadway. And so they put this netting on the thing for 2 years while they did a bunch of cleaning and restoration on the rest of the building. And by the end of the project, they sort of kicked this problem down the road. And ultimately, basically by the 70s, modernism was not kind to the terracotta industry. The modernism, to the modernist ethic, applied ornamentation was absolutely anathema. So by the 70s, the terracotta industry was in deep decline, and they basically concluded that the expertise was not there to replace these things. There's all of this very intricate ornamentation. There were very few firms still in business doing it, and also the modern methods they were using did not allow the intricate undercutting that would allow for all this detail. There's one more picture I want to show you. So here's from the side, these gargoyles. This is the northeastern Tyrell on the uptown side on Broadway that I was telling you about. These guys, that's the top of the cone where the coal smoke used to escape from. And this right here is actually where the scene I'm going to read to you takes place. But so what did they do? They had this Tourelle. It had all of this crumbling, failing terracotta on it. So they did a rather dramatic and sort of gruesome thing, which is they covered it in aluminum siding. They actually stripped all 4 of these Tourelles of all of their terracotta, including the gargoyles, every little piece of it, and they put this Disney version of an architectural masterpiece on these Tourelles. So, here you see the intricate Gothic gable here, and then this is like a Disney version of it. The most heartbreaking thing about it is these guys. What are those? Those giant things that look like giant toothpicks. That's where the gargoyles used to live. So, I don't know, somebody decided it would be a great idea to have some kind of projecting horizontal element as a kind of lame replacement for these beautiful gargoyles that had once been there. All of this begs the question of what happened to those 32 deposed gargoyles after they were removed in the 70s. And I asked Tim Allenbrook, the preservation architect on this project, about it, and he said, well, last time he saw them, a great number of them were under lock and key on the 28th floor in a storeroom in the Woolworth Building under the control of the Woolworth Building. And as a matter of fact, Tim himself, so when I envisioned, when I envisioned having a gargoyle stolen from the top of this building, it was just my imagination. I mean, everybody knows that there's some gargoyles somewhere on the Woolworth Building, but I had the idea that they would be at the top of the building. I contact Tim, and not only did he tell me that these gargoyles had been here at the top of the building, he owns one. They actually gave him, the project manager at the end of the project gave him a Terra Cotta gargoyle that he keeps by his fireplace in upstate New York. So that was given to him maybe 1980, 1981. The year after that, he saw one more at Urban Archaeology, it's an architectural salvage company, a business that is in Lower Manhattan. It's now in Tribeca. It's still in business, actually. And this is his gargoyle. This is in the 70s. I particularly like this image because it's got the tab can, which captures the period that I'm writing about. That was the last surviving gargoyle that I knew of until a couple months ago when I went to visit this wonderful crusty character named Roy Susskind, who I joke owns the Woolworth Building. Roy doesn't own the Woolworth Building, but he runs it and has for almost 2 decades. He's an executive at the Witkoff Group, which bought the building in 1998, and he's actually president of the condo. And he oversees a lot of the construction and anything that goes on in there. And Roy is a bit of a hoarder. Roy has like 40,000 photographs of the Woolworth Building. He's got 100 years of blueprints and documentation and letters. He's the one who told me about the Woolworth letter, excoriating Cass Gilbert for the failing Terra Cotta in 1913. Roy's a bit of a hoarder. And if any of you guys remember the Collier brothers? Well, the Collier brothers would feel right at home in Roy's office. So this is a couple months ago. Roy he's crusty on the exterior, but he's got a heart of gold. He's really a lovely guy. He's done me a lot of favors and in my research. And I was in his office a couple months ago. I actually took this picture illicitly, and he saw it at another presentation I gave and didn't bat an eye. He was perfectly happy, but I was a little nervous about it because he snuck into the lecture at the last minute. But I was in his office a couple months ago, and he was getting something for me on his giant computer monitor. He was looking through these 40,000 photos. And while he was doing that, my eye wandered up to a shelf high up in the top of his office near the ceiling. And there, surrounded by all kinds of technical manuals and other crap, was looking forlornly, just inches up at the drop ceiling, was another Terra Cotta gargoyle. This is the twin of the one that Tim Allenbrook, the preservation architect, has. So this actually concludes the fact portion of this evening. I will actually tell you one little aside, complete coincidence. So there is this diaspora, right? We only know these 2 gargoyles. There's a diaspora of 30 more that are out there somewhere. Some may have been destroyed, but some of them clearly were acquired or liberated at a later date. And a friend of mine recently was reading my novel at a private school in the Upper West Side, and he was picking up his child there, and he got talking with another parent, and he told her about that the Woolworth Building and its gargoyles were in this book. And it turned out she worked at the Woolworth Building in the late 90s when they were disposing of these, and she said she was involved in the disposition of these. And I said to my friend, I've been writing articles about this. I'd really like to talk to her. And he said, she doesn't want to talk to you. So we don't know what happened to the rest of those gargoyles. But now, as I say, the fact part is over. I'm going to read you a section of the chapter that grew out of the research that I just described for you. I need to give you some of the context. Basically, it's the mid-1970s. It's the middle of the night. I'm telling you, this scene takes place at the point where 31 of those 32 gargoyles have been severed and destroyed on the building, and there is one gargoyle left hanging over Broadway. And poor 13-year-old Griffin's father, his manic, obsessive father, is hell-bent on rescuing that last gargoyle before the demolition contractors come in the morning to destroy it. So he wakes poor Griffin up at about 2 in the morning. They break into the Woolworth Building. They go up to the 53rd floor. They climb out, and they go around the edge of the building where there's about an 18-inch wide gutter, and they go this is not the same gargoyle, but it's the same type. They go up to the base of one of these Tourelles, the one that's open at the top. And the only other thing I need to tell you, one face of that Tourelle already has aluminum siding on it, which actually happened. Tim had given me a picture there. They had originally mocked it up. It's just a test to see how it would look. And the only other thing you need to know is that, so if this is the Tourelle, there's actually scaffolding coming up the side of the building, but the scaffolding ends, 15 or 20 feet below where the action I'm going to describe to you takes place. And now I'm going to put on my glasses, and I just got these today, so I hope they're the right prescription. Excuse me. Dad was on his knees by his duffel now, pulling out a coiled yellow extension cord and a nicked-up power saw of a size and shape I'd never seen before. It had a curved trigger and a long blade with fierce teeth. He went back along the narrow gutter on the Broadway side of the building, pushed open an ornately gabled window, and found an electrical outlet inside somewhere. He returned a minute later, playing the cord out behind him, then plugged the saw into it. "This is a sawzall," he told me, firing it up. He had to raise his voice to be heard over its phlegmy growl. "Got a nice reciprocal blade on it." I'd never seen a tool like that. It was ferociously loud, with a serrated saw blade that went zhigga, zhigga, zhigga in and out. Dad motioned me to stand back, then went to town on the aluminum siding, the sawzall making horrible shrieking noises as it chewed through the sheet metal. "Footholds," he said simply when he was done, gesturing up at the series of irregular, jagged-edged holes he'd cut all the way up the aluminum flank of the Tourelle. "Only the best for my boy." I must have said, "Me?" Because Dad immediately snapped, "Of course you. I weigh 195 pounds. You think you can belay me?" Up above us, vertical terracotta pinnacles ringed the top of the Tourelle shaft like the pointy parts that stick up around the periphery of a crown. Dad took a length of rope from his bag and, wearing work gloves, climbed far enough up the Tourelle's side to reach up and feed the rope's end around one of these pinnacles. He climbed down and tied the rope to the back of my belt, giving me a bit of a wedgie as he tugged the knot to test it. "Pretty good, I think," he said, handing me up the gloves. "Up you go." Again, with that shooing motion of his hands. He'd gotten himself so worked up that I didn't dare protest. I knew how scary he could get when he thought you were standing in the way of something he wanted. Up I went, while Dad looped the rope around his back and bent his knees in a ready-for-anything stance. I began picking my way up the Tourelle, using the holes he'd cut in the aluminum as hand and footholds. What surprised me most when I pulled myself up to stand in the wind on the Tourelle's rim was that I was even more afraid of falling into that Tourelle than off it. Unlike its three purely ornamental siblings, which were closed on top, this Tourelle was open to allow coal smoke to escape. So I was basically standing on the rim of an enormous defunct smokestack with an open grillwork cone rising above me. I'd always had a terror of falling into holes, and that's what the inside of that Tourelle was, a 700-foot deep hole. If I was clumsy enough to tumble in, my spindly body would plunge straight down to the basement furnace, arms wheeling. "I don't like all the abrasion that pinnacle is giving our rope," Dad called up to me. "You're going to need more mobility than that. Hang on a sec, and let me see what equipment I can find down where they're working on the 27th floor. "Wait!" I cried into the wind. But he was already gone, disappeared around the corner below, where he either couldn't hear me or pretended he couldn't. He had left me again. I felt my testicles tighten up close to my crotch in fear, as if they wanted desperately to retreat clear up into my stomach. It was a sickening feeling. You never feel more alone than when someone was with you just a second ago. I made a point of not looking around while he was gone, instead crouching on the rim and hugging the pinnacle, which was sooty gray and cracked. I tried to imagine what Dad might be up to from moment to moment. Breaking into a storeroom downstairs somewhere, poking around in a tool chest with his powerful hands, hurrying back to see me. Surely, if I concentrated hard enough on him, he would in turn think of me, and that would be almost like being together. When Dad came back, he was carrying a big oval object that rattled as he walked. He told me to untie the rope from my belt and feed the end down to him, still keeping the rope looped around the pinnacle. When I fished the rope back up, my catch was a big wooden pulley with a green box cutter duct taped to its side. That's a pulley from one of the hanging scaffolds they're using to clean the facade, Dad said. Got some other handy stuff too, but I'll send that up to you later. For now, I was to untie the pulley, drop the rope back down to him, and climb around the rim of the Tourelle to the gargoyle. When you got a nice angle on it, just clip the pulley to the grillage above you and wait for me. I did as I was told. No longer tied to anything, no longer protected in any way, I gingerly made my way around the crumbly rim of the Tourelle with the pulley under my right arm, stopping periodically to catch my breath and try to get my heartbeat to slow down. The wind was picking up, blowing across the open ring of the Tourelle with a resonant, melancholy hum, a deeper, more haunting version of the sound made by a breath across the top of a Coke bottle. For a moment, I again imagined falling in and started to feel sickish. To distract myself and keep warm, I tucked my chin into my chest, blowing hot air into the front of my down jacket. The outside of the Tyrell's shaft below me was still covered in black netting, with some weird exceptions. Every few feet, the top of the netting had been shredded. Peering down in those places, I saw a kind of Terra Cotta stump, which I guessed was all that remained of the gargoyle that had once made its home there. It was easy to see what had gotten Dad so hopping mad. It did something to your stomach to see a violent absence up close like that. After passing 2 or 3 of these stumps, edging far around the Tourelle toward the dark gulf above Broadway, I leaned down to see this time not an absence, but a presence. A sharply defined, long-necked figure jutting from the wall with prickly alacrity. The creature's body strained against the taut black netting that covered it, and if I hadn't known what it was, I would have thought it was alive. You could feel the energy coming off it, and the more I peered down at it, the more details of its exotic body I could make out. Curled claws gripping the facade, muscular, distrustful haunches ready to spring, a spread of feathers that might have been wings, an arched back and tense, alert neck, all watchfulness and cold, coiled power. And then, something amusing, or so it seemed to me, something that cried out for closer inspection. But first, to free up my hands. The old wooden pulley had a kind of clip at the top. I stood up tall and attached it to a steel crosspiece on the grillwork above me, then untaped the green box cutter from its side. Crouching down again and releasing the blade with a thumb flick, I began to slash at the black netting that shrouded the gargoyle. It was satisfying to watch the mesh fall away. And when I'd laid bare the gargoyle's form, I saw that I'd been right to be amused, for the surging Terra Cotta creature was wearing what appeared to be an improvised leash. Looped around his neck and running in a taut diagonal up to a bolt in the wall above him was a weathered, small-linked chain. Okay, so we're going to jump ahead in the chapter. In the meantime, Griffin's father appears below Griffin on the scaffold, about 15 feet below Griffin. And the father's belaying Griffin. He's holding one end of a rope that goes up to the pulley at the top of the cone, the top of the Tourelle, comes down and ties into poor Griffin's belt loop at the bottom. And first the father sends on a rope, he sends up to Griffin a circular saw that Griffin uses to cut around the neck of the gargoyle. And then so the only thing holding it on now is a bronze rod that runs through it that we discussed before. So the father then sends up to Griffin that long, nasty saw blade again called the Sawzall. And all that needs to happen is that the bronze rod needs to be cut. I permitted myself a glance at my surroundings. The sky was a touch lighter, the city a tad less protective of its secrets. The bulky smudges of darkness downtown were beginning to resolve themselves into something like buildings. Now this sawzall is jerkier than the circular saw, Dad called up from the scaffold planking. So to get better leverage, you're going to want to lock the blade in the on position by hitting the little button above the trigger with your thumb. Then you're just going to ease the blade into that cut you've already made. When you're ready, just put a little extra pressure on that top handle with your left hand and guide the blade slowly down onto the rod. When you've cut all the way through, that chain leash should keep the gargoyle from falling very far. By the time I was comfortable with my angle and balance, my head was tipped down so far that I could feel the blood thumping in my temples. "Don't worry, lean over as far as you need to," Dad said. "I've got you." I eased the blade into the slot on the gargoyle's neck, the way he'd told me, squeezed the trigger, and thumbed the blade lock. Right away, I could tell something was wrong. I'd forgotten you're supposed to turn on a saw before making contact with the thing you're cutting. And as soon as that crazy zhigga-zhigga blade started trying to jerk up and down, I realized it was fighting me and fighting the gargoyle too. The blade was jammed in that slot, and it didn't like it. To try to loosen it, I leaned farther off the building and shoved down with my left hand, driving hard from my elbow. At first, the saw didn't dislodge, just struggled further, its motor growling, all that pugnacious, herky-jerky energy, transferring not to the blade, but up through my hands and arms, causing me to shift my weight abruptly to keep from falling. Maybe that sudden movement bent the blade or jogged something loose, or both, but for one quick moment, the sawzall seemed to move as it should, its blade sliding down into the slot, sawing rhythmically up and down. Until I felt it jolt against the rod, felt it catch and stutter, and then kick back toward me with startling violence, the butt of the saw handle smashing me in the shoulder and knocking me off balance. I was falling then, tumbling sideways right off the building, dropping the sawzall to throw my arms around the gargoyle's long neck, a lunge of desperation that seemed, remarkably, to stop my fall, until I felt that wonderful abrupt tug at my waist and realized that it was not the gargoyle, but Dad who was supporting me, holding strong at the other end of the rope that connected me to him. In that moment, practically strangling the gargoyle with my arms in my confusion of desperation and gratitude, I saw the sawzall dropping toward the scaffold beneath me, its jagged teeth sawing the air. It didn't hit Dad. It landed on the planking a couple of feet from him, but with its blade still pumping fiercely back and forth, it skittered wildly across the wood toward his ankles, forcing him to leap out of its path. There was no way he could have held on to that rope. I felt it go limp at my waist, felt the burden of my own weight grow suddenly enormous on the gargoyle. I gripped him tighter in my desperation, heaving my skinny chest farther up onto his skinny neck, which, to my amazement, remained attached to the building. Then, slowly, almost serenely, the skyline creature began dipping his head toward the street. There was a contemplativeness to his movement, a deliberation, until his neck snapped cleanly at the cut I'd made, the little chain leash yanked right out of the wall, and I was plummeting through the open air toward the street, hugging this useless, dragon-eared hunk of terra cotta to my chest. And that, I think, is what they call a cliffhanger. That's not the end of the chapter. Thanks very much.
John, in fact, would you join us? Would you join us up here? Thank you. John, that was such a fantastic presentation, and your knowledge was so comprehensive about the Woolworth Building. And as for the reading and the extract from the book, it was absolutely gripping. And I know we're all going to want to rush up to purchase this book, which is on for sale at the back of the room. So please, after we finish these remarks, I hope you will join. And in fact, John will be going straight up to that table. So if you have any questions, you can ask him at the author signing table. But to tonight, it is our tradition to make a presentation to our speakers from the lecture series. And to do this, we have Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director.
And I know that I want to rush and see what happened in the rest of the story. So we won't make you wait any longer to find out and get your books. So, John, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, founded 1785, we express our gratitude to John Freeman Gill, author of the Gargoyle Hunters, for his participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
And, well, and as many of you who come here, you know the next part of this. Once you've lectured here, we really don't let you go, so we've made you a lifetime member of the library.
I was gonna join anyway, so you just cost yourself $30.
You're not a senior.
And just a little memento, a General Society bag, and
Thomas's window.
the poster of tonight. I know you have the book cover, but a little reminder. Yes, we're doing this. Yeah. And finally, I also just want to mention that we have a special window display by our window curator, Thomas Donahue. And in fact, I forgot to ask you, John, if you'd had a chance to see it, but I hope you will see it. And it has an angel, a Terra Cotta angel in it. I don't think Thomas could find a gargoyle, but it looks pretty good. He did a fantastic job. That said, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I want to express our appreciation to Simeon and Michelle from the Historic District Council. I hope you, for those of you who this is your first visit, you'll come back and visit us again.